Hi guys, we are discussing the book The Rigvedic People by Acharya B.B. Lal, and today we start the third chapter called The Aryan Immigration Alternative 2 Under Scanner. It starts with a quote from Oliver Goldsmith's book Village Schoolmaster. The quote says, "Even though vanquished, he would argue still." Now B.B. Lal writes, "Argue they must, because it is their sacred duty to fight for their committed cause, namely that the Aryans must have come from outside. Thus failing to sustain the Aryan invasion theory, two eminent scholars from India to go in for an alternative. They postulate an Aryan immigration, not invasion now. Thus Professor Romila Thapar, our good friend, a well-known historian, came out with the alternative theory by avowing, now this is a quote from Professor Thapar, if invasion is discarded, then the mechanism of migration and occasional contacts come into sharper focus. The migrations appear to have been of pastoral cattle breeders who are prominent in the Avesta and the Rigveda. Avesta is the sacred holy book of the Zoroastrians. Faithfully following her, in fact elaborating her new thesis, Professor R.S. Sharma, another good friend of ours, another noted historian, asserted in 1999 that the pastoralists who moved into the Indian borderland came from the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, or BMAC, which saw the genesis of the culture of the Rigveda. Thus, the Thapar-Sharma theory envisages that 1. The authors of the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex were pastoral cattle breeders. 2. They were Aryans. 3. They entered into the Indo-Pakistan subcontinent as immigrants. We shall now examine all the three assumptions one by one. A profile of the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. To begin with, we shall give, though briefly, the various cultural constituents of that BMAC and then assess whether this complex can be regarded as that of pastoral cattle breeders, as held by the Thapar-Sharma duo. Many sites in Bactria in northern Afghanistan and in Margiana in Turkestan have been excavated by eminent archaeologists including Victor I. Saryanidhi. The excavations have brought to light many monumental buildings and a variety of rich artifacts, to some of which we shall refer below. Town planning and other architectural remains. Though mostly made out of mud bricks, the residential houses were often very large and elaborate, some of the rooms being marked out for specific purposes. But it is the monumental buildings which call for special attention. Here we shall refer to a temple complex and a citadel. The temple complex at Togolok 21 in Margiana covers an area of about 1.5 hectares. The main structures in the central part are enclosed by three successive peripheral walls. Of these, the innermost one, enclosing an area of about 60 by 50 meters, is 5 meters in thickness and is provided with circular towers at each corner and semicircular ones on the eastern and western sides. The two other peripheral walls, successively on the outer side, also have the same kind of features in so far as the towers are concerned. Likewise, the citadel at Gonur, also in Margiana, is a very elaborate affair. A look at figure 3.2 will convince of the same. Let's see if I can show you 3.2. Okay, it's just a bird's eye view, a map of sorts. Look at this. Pause your video and look at this map. A look at this figure 3.2 will convince one of the same. Roughly rectangular on plan, it stretches over an area measuring 120 by 115 meters. The fortification wall has rectangular towers, 4 on each side and 1 at each corner. There were about a dozen buildings inside, which included, besides the king's residence, administrative blocks, assembly halls, cult structures, etc. There was an area earmarked even for burial sites. Now, sculptural art. We present here two specimens of sculptural art, one each of a human and an animal figure. The former is that of a seated lady from Bactria, figure 3.3. This is the figure. In order to bring out the contrast in the portrayal, the sculptor has chosen a blackish stone for the dress with which a major part of the body is covered, but a pinkish white one for the head and hands. Also to be noted are not only the herringbone weaves of the garment, but also the details in the depiction of hairstyle. It is not just the human beings that attracted the attention of the BMAC artists, but the animal world as well. There are many examples of excellently carved out animal figurines. As an example, we present here that of a feline, made of chlorite stone. The entire body is covered with gold leaf, which is further decorated with a variety of semi-precious stones. The facial expression of the animal is superb in figure 3.4. This is the 3.4 figure. The specimen comes from Bactria. Now, metal objects. The BMAC sites have yielded a rich harvest of metal objects, variously in copper, bronze, silver and gold. Here we would like to draw the reader's attention to a highly specialized axe made of silver and covered with gold lamina. However, it is not the metal content that is so important as the design and decoration, which is in figure 3.5. This is the figure 3.5. The axe has a large socket at the butt end, with heads of two eagles jutting out. Beautiful. Pause the video, rewind the video and watch that picture again. The axe has a large socket at the butt end with heads of two eagles jutting out. On the socket there sits a winged feline with the front legs outstretched and the mouth wide open. On the blade may also have been some decorative motifs. Evidently, this particular axe was not meant for the ordinary purpose of cutting firewood. It definitely had some specialized use, and the nearest that one can think of in the rich and elaborate setup of the BMAC is that it may have been mounted on a silver staff and used by the ruler, maybe a king, as a ceremonial axe. With such elaborate monumental buildings, richly carved out human and animal sculptures, and the ceremonial silver axe, can the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex be regarded as the product of pastoral cattle breeders, as Thapar and Sharma would like us to believe? Perhaps no further comments are needed. Now, the BMAC vis-a-vis the Aryans. We now pass on to the second aspect of the problem, namely whether the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex can be regarded as being that of the Aryans. In this context, Saryanidhi has advanced 4 types of supportive evidences. These are 1. Motifs on the seals, 2. Fire worship, 3. Soma, 4. Asvamedha or horse sacrifice. 1. Motifs on the seals. The BMAC has yielded a large number of amulets and seals. While the amulets depict simple motifs like snakes, scorpions, eagles, two-humped Bactrian camels, etc., it is the seals that call for special attention. In particular, the cylindrical ones. These carry some kind of a running story, and we illustrate here 2 of these. The one illustrated as figure 3.6, this is the diagram. This is not a diagram per se, it's the actual picture of that, that object. The one illustrated as figure 3.6 shows a standing human figure having an avian head with wings arising from each of these shoulders. He holds a mountain goat-like animal in each of the hands. Eagles fly in the sky adjacent to the figure's head. The other seal in figure 3.7, this figure, the other seal has a different story to tell. On it, there are 2 standing figures, each with an animal head. They hold a vertical pole on the pointed top of which rests the belly of another human figure with an animal head. This latter figure lies horizontally, as if the belly is going to be pierced by the pole. Behind the standing human figures are seated animal-headed humans, one of whom plays on a drum. Professor Saryanidhi banks heavily on the motifs on the BMAC seals as a proof that the BMAC people having been the ancestors of the Indo-Aryans. He says in 1993, "In this connection worthy of utmost attention is the impression of a cylinder seal on one of the Margianian vessels found at Gonur. The central figure of a frequently repeated frieze composition, Frieze, repeated frieze composition is a standing nude anthropomorphic winged deity with an avian head holding two mountain goats by the legs. Such an anthropomorphic winged and avian-headed deities are represented fairly fully in the glyphics and on the seals of Bactria. These Bactrian images find the most impressive correspondence in Syro-Hittite glyptics. The Syrian and Hittite region, Syro-Hittite glyptics. If the fact that it is for the Mitanni kingdom that the names of Aryan deities are evidenced is taken into account, the importance of the Bactrian Margianian images will become obvious in the light of solving the Aryan problem on the basis of new archaeological data. Since certain motifs on Bibilal writes, since certain motifs on the BMAC seals compare well with those on the Syro-Hittite glyptics, it may be reasonable to say that there were some cultural contacts between the two areas. But on the basis of the simple fact that a Hittite Mitanni treaty, that is the Bogazkoy one, refers to the Vedic gods like Indra, Mitra, Varuna, etc., it is absolutely far-fetched to hold, as Saryanidhi does, that the BMAC people were ancestral to the Vedic Aryans. Let's read this paragraph again. Since certain motifs on the BMAC seals compare well with those on the Syro-Hittite glyptics, it may be reasonable to say that there were some cultural contacts. Nothing more than that. Some cultural contacts between the two areas. But on the basis of the simple fact that a Hittite Mitanni treaty refers to the Vedic gods like Indra, Mitra, Varuna, etc., it is absolutely far-fetched to hold that the BMAC people were ancestral to the Vedic Aryans. Now, fire worship. In one of his papers, Saryanidhi states that a building unearthed at Gonur Temenos and conveniently called a fort has a cross-shaped general plan with 12 corner towers. It most closely resembles the outer contours of the indisputable fire temple at Tepe Nushijan. A difference of minor importance only consists of the fact that while the towers are round at Gonur, they were square at Nush-Ijan. However, Saryanidhi goes on to admit, unfortunately, the fort at Gonur Temenos appears to be unfinished, so we do not know its inner construction, but apparently it was a fire temple. Now, Bibilal writes, the reader should be able to see very clearly the innate weakness in Saryanidhi's argument. When the Gonur Temenos is unfinished and nothing is known about its contents, how can it be taken to have been a fire temple? Let not imagination have the upper hand. 3. The Soma. The Soma was a very favorite drink with the Vedic people. It was offered to the gods as well. In the Avesta, it is referred to as Haoma, the Sanskrit sibilant S having changed to H, which always happened. They used to refer to Saraswati as Haravati, and even today we replace Asham as Ahom and Sapta as Hafta. S and H is always replaceable in the southern subcontinent. Saryanidhi states that this substance is the same as ephedra, though not many scholars agree with that equation. Anyway, he claims to have found this substance in the temple complex at Togolok 21, referred to earlier. However, Harry Nyberg, a well-known expert on the subject who examined the sample, does not agree that the given substance is really ephedra. This is what he has to say. In 1995, Harry Nyberg says, remains of ephedras have also been reported from the temple fortress complex of Togolok 21 in the Merv oasis of ancient Margiana Parpola in 1988. Meyer Melikan in 1990, along with the remains of poppies in 1990. In 1990, I received some samples from the site forwarded by Dr. Fred Hybert of Harvard University, which were subjected to pollen analysis at the Department of Botany, University of Helsinki. The largest amount of pollen was found in the bone tube used for imbibing liquid, perhaps from Gonur 1. But even in this sample, which had been preserved in a comparatively sheltered position when compared with the other investigated samples, only pollen of the family Cariophyllaceae was present. No pollen from ephedras or poppies was found, and even the pollen left in the samples showed clear traces of deterioration typical in ancient pollen having been preserved in a dry environment in contact with oxygen. Our pollen analysis was carefully checked for any methodological errors, but no inaccuracies were found. So Bibilal writes, it would thus be seen that even the identification of ephedra is doubtful. How can we then bank on the Soma theory? Now 4. The Ashwamedha, horse sacrifice. When one is keen to establish a theory, one draws upon any possible evidence that may come one's way. Thus, Saryanidhi has pushed into the discussion the skeleton of a horse whose head is missing and calls it an example of the Ashwamedha, a figure in 3.8. It would have been seen from the photograph that the skeleton lies hardly a few centimeters below the ground level, which is observable on the top left of the photograph. Also, there is no outline of a pit in which the horse may have been given a burial. There is no evidence of the animal having been deliberately beheaded, and the absence of the head may be due to a variety of reasons, such as subsequent human interference or even an erosional process. The most important point is that the skeletal remains do not conform to what is laid down in the Rigveda itself in respect of a horse sacrifice. For example, RV 1.16 Rigveda 162.18 runs as follows. Griffith's translation of the Rigveda, volume 1, page 216. The 4 and 30 ribs of the swift charger, kin to the gods, the slayer's hatchet pierces. Cut ye with skill, so that the parts be flawless, and piece by piece declaring them, dissect them. It would be observed that there is no evidence of the quote-unquote cutting of the skeleton piece by piece, as prescribed. Hence, it is clearly not an example of an Ashwamedha. By now, the reader would have seen that all the four pillars, namely the motifs on the ceilings, fire worship, Soma, and the Ashwamedha, on which the edifice of the association of the BMAC with the Vedic culture was sought to be erected, have collapsed one by one. And here is something no less important. Attention may be drawn to the two maps at figure 3.9 and 3.10, which were published by Saryanidhi himself as figures 2 and 5 along with his 1993 B paper, only the brackets are added by me. Of these, figure 3.9, this one, 3.9 shows the distribution of the motif of man-bird with hit animals. It would be observed that this favorite BMAC motif occurs from the Bactria-Margiana region on the east to the Syro-Hittite region on the west, but does not occur in the region southeast of the BMAC area. However, miniature bowls bearing on their rims the animal and snake motifs and miniature columns, again a characteristic of the BMAC, do travel westwards as well as southwards, but they do not cross the Indus on the east, which is shown in figure 3.10. Therefore, the distribution maps thus clearly show that these characteristic BMAC elements did not at all enter the Vedic region, which was east of the Indus. At the same time, it would be unfair not to refer to a few items which occur east of the Indus and have their counterparts in Central Asia. For example, a double spiral-headed copper pin from Chanhudaro, two animal-headed copper pins from Harappa, and some clay dealings from Gilund. But these stray items do not call for a migration of the BMAC people into India. They could very well have been the result of trade contacts, as have been visualized in the case of the occurrence of a variety of typical Harappan objects in Central and Western Asia. Now, Parpola's sword. In a paper published in 1993, Asko Parpola, the learned scholar from Finland, states, a newly found antenna-hilted sword from Bactria paralleling those from Fatehgarh suggests that this same wave of immigrants, that is from the BMAC, may also have introduced the Gangetic copper hoards into India. Now Bibilal writes, while the similarity between the Bactrian and Fatehgarh swords is alright in figure 3.11, this one is alright, the theory on that basis of immigration of the BMAC people into the Gangetic region is indeed a far cry. This kind of sword is just a part of the Gangetic copper hoards, which include a number of other varieties such as harpoons, anthropomorphic figures, shouldered axes, etc. in figure 3.12. So many of them, which have never been found in the BMAC context. And that is not the entire point. Whereas in the BMAC area we have found only a single specimen, in the Gangetic region there occur hundreds and hundreds of these copper hoard artifacts. Even a beginner in archaeology would straight away say that the single BMAC specimen cannot be the parent of the Gangetic copper hoard culture. On the other hand, it is the BMAC specimen which must have been taken there from the Gangetic region. Enough of BMAC immigrants, please. So they find one sword in the BMAC region and assume that that's how they contributed to the culture of the Gangetic plains. But they refuse to take into account that there might have been a possibility at least that it is the Gangetic plains who contributed this kind of sword making to BMAC. This is just their racial and cultural supremacy working here. There's no fucking history and science here. Therefore, the conclusion of this chapter that even the Aryan migration thesis is flawed is that the claim by Romila Thapar and R.S. Sharma is that they were pastoralists, which could not have happened if they had such an elaborate culture and elaborate building complexes and places for kings and different kinds of seals, etc. All those things that we have discussed elaborately in the earlier video, that could not have happened if they were just pastoralists running around with their cattle herds and living in a hut. That would not be the case. And the other 4 arguments done by Professor Saryanidhi is that because of on these 4 facts, that there was fire worship, there was motifs on seals, and the Ashwamedha and the Soma. And the 4 counters to these arguments is that the seals are so far-fetched, and why they were far-fetched, you will get that in the video. But they were far-fetched and that they could have been just for cultural exchange and for trade purposes. The fire worship cannot be concluded significantly because the fire temple that they are claiming to be is a fire temple is not even a finished structure. 3. The Soma is not in fact the Soma because Saryanidhi concluded it to be similar as the ephedra, and an expert on that, a doctor of botany, is saying that it's not the same. That ephedra is not even Soma. And 4. The Ashwamedha. If indeed that headless horse is the sign of Ashwamedha, even that argument is flawed because that's not how Ashwamedha is recommended in the Veda. If that is something, even if that is deliberately a murder of a horse, that is not Ashwamedha. So even all these arguments supporting the Aryan migration theory fails.